Hi, and let's continue on to our second project in this series. In this project, we will be working on a to-do list. The functionality of the to-do list will include adding up to 5 items. Of course, by changing the code, you can customize this list to add up to 10 items or as many as you want. We will code the function to add an item by clicking on the Add button. You will also be able to add an item using the Enter key on the keyboard. You will be able to strike through and undo a strike through across a list item. And then you can delete an individual item. You will reset the input field to a blank each time that a list item is added. And lastly, we will code the function to delete an entire list, therefore resetting our to-do list. This project introduces a new concept called arrays, which is a powerful and important concept as it reduces the amount of redundant code in our project. With this, let's go ahead and begin our to-do list project. Before we get into coding, let's take a minute or so to understand what's going on with the HTML and CSS portion of the project. This may seem like a drag, but it will speed things up if you familiarize yourself with the structure and style of the to-do list since we are working with the DOM. Now, the HTML portion contains a div with the class of a flip container and ID called main container. This is our main wrapper div. That is, it is the outermost div within which we will place our other items. Inside the main container, we have another div called flipped. The flip div contains the front and back side of our to-do list. The front portion is relatively simple. It's a div with a class set to front, and this contains these font awesome icons right here where you can see the pencil list and coffee cup. It also has an H1 heading which contains the text daily to-do list. And coming back, we have the closing tag for the front div and the opening tag for the div called back, which will contain our list items. Inside our div called back, we have an H1 heading that says add items, and here it is. Subsequently, we also have a row div that contains two column medium 12 divs. The first call medium 12 div contains our input field to add text, and we've set the ID of the input field to do input. And besides our input field, we have two buttons right here set to add and clear. Each one of these buttons has an on-click attribute whose value is the function that is triggered when the buttons are clicked. And lastly, our second column medium 12 div has an ID set to list items and contains an unordered list tag with the ID of myUL. This is the div which will hold our list items, which will appear below the input field right here. And then we have our closing tags. So this concludes a brief intro of the HTML structure of the to-do list. Moving on, let's check out the CSS. The CSS portion is pretty self-explanatory. It contains styles for the body, main flip and flipped containers, and flip styles, which will transform the div when someone hovers over it. Moving on, we have the styles for the front portion, which you see here, and lastly, we have the style rules for the back portion. Now, the style rules for the back portion contain rules for the input field and the add and clear buttons. We also have style rules for list items which don't exist as yet. And the thing to notice here is that you see style rules for the list item button class. And this class is for the buttons that will be besides each individual list item. We will be coding in these buttons in the JavaScript portion of our project. I encourage you to go over the HTML and CSS portion once again because it'll familiarize you with the project further. We won't be doing any animations in this project, so don't get hung up on the flip animation styles. With that, let's begin coding in the functionality of our to-do list with JavaScript. Arrays are a collection of items that are referenced by a single variable. Conceptualize it as a cupboard wherein you can store multiple things. There are two ways of creating arrays, so let's go over those. The first one is called array literal. Array literals are created by enclosing the list of items separated by commas within square brackets, and then assigning the array to a variable such as you see in var todo list. In this example, you can see that the list items buy milk, get eggs, gym, and finish project are separated by commas. And since they are strings, they are enclosed within quotation marks. This is much simpler than, say, assigning var milk the value of buy milk, and then var eggs the value of get eggs, and so on. And this is what I meant by when I said that an array is a collection of items. An array can store other data types. For example, the array list holds a number, a string, and a boolean. An array can also be empty and hold nothing in it, as we see in var completed chores, which references an empty array that will presumably be filled with the names of completed chores as they get done. Moving on, you can also create an array with the new keyword as in the array referenced by var dogs. Though this is not as pretty, so we'll be using array literals. Now let's learn a bit more about arrays before we create our first array. Arrays, like strings, have properties such as length. The length property of an array is accessed by the array name and then the dot notation followed by the keyword length. The length property of an array will return the number of items in an array. So you can see that to-do-list.length returns 4. The index property of an array returns an item located at the specific position in an array, and the index of an item in an array starts at position 0, just as the index of a character in a string starts at position 0. And to-do list dot the index position 1 returns the string get eggs. Moving on, you can do multiple things with the items within an array with array methods. We've already talked about what functions are, and to reiterate, functions are a block of code. So then how is this definition related to methods? What all can you do with arrays? Methods are blocks of pre-built-in functions that are used to perform some action on arrays and other objects. As a side note, arrays are considered objects in JavaScript. I won't get into explaining objects right now. Just like strings are considered an object and have properties and methods which allow you to query the characteristics of a string, such as its length, or methods that allow you to do something with the string, such as the index of method, as we used in our calculator project, the same way you can do things with the items within an array with array methods. And push, pop, and splice are the array methods that we will use in this project. Now let's start coding in some functionality with JavaScript. Open up your JavaScript file called main.js in the to-do list project folder, and this is where we will work. First, declare an empty array with var task list is equal to open brackets and close brackets followed by a semicolon. The task list array is where we will be storing our to-do list item as a user inputs them in the input field right here. This is a global variable and can be accessed by all functions in our script. The first function of our project will allow us to get the user input and assemble a list of items in the DOM. Therefore, relating to this, we will be talking about the string length property and trim method. Additionally, we will use the push method, so we'll talk about that. And lastly, we will go over these DOM methods and the input value property. We've used the length property in our calculator project, wherein we displayed an error message in the event either num1 or num2 strings were greater than 10 characters each. So to reiterate, the length property of a string will return the number of characters in the string, and we access the length property of a string with the dot notation. Any white space within the quotation marks counts as characters. As you can see in our example, var string is equal to hello world. There are 3 spaces before the word hello as I press the spacebar 3 times. And there are also 3 spaces after the word world and 1 space in between the 2 words. Therefore, the total number of characters, including those of the words hello and world, are 17. Now, how does this relate to the trim method? Well, the trim method of a string will trim the white spaces at the beginning and end of a string. To apply the trim method on var string, use the dot notation. And in our example, var trimmed string is assigned the result of the trim method on var string. And when we console log this, we see that the white space at the start and at the end of the string has been removed. And when we console log the length of the trimmed string, we get 11, which is the number of the characters in the words hello and world, including the 1 space in between them. Okay, now let's talk about the array push method a bit. And as I mentioned, methods are pre-built-in functions. This method will add an item at the end of an array. That is, it pushes an item to the end. And within brackets, it will take the items that you want to add to the array as an argument. If there is more than 1 item, the items must be separated by commas. And this adding of items changes the length property of the array. In our example here, var todo is an empty array. We apply the push method on var todo using the dot notation to pass the string complete project within brackets to the array. And now when we console log the length of the array, it returns 1 as there is only 1 item in the todo array. And if you check the index of todo at position 0, it console logs to the string complete project. And then when we add the string organized room, the length changes to 2. Whereas as you can see here, the index at position 0 remains the same and console logs to the string complete project. This demonstrates that the push method does not change the index property of items within an array. Only the length property changes. And this is because items are still at the same position as before, since items are being added or pushed to the end of the array. Therefore, only the total number of items in the array changes, that is, its length. Now, moving on, let's talk about DOM methods. The DOM methods that we discuss here are the ones that we will be using in our function add item. These methods will assist in assembling the DOM once we get the user input and then display it on the web page within the opening and closing UL tag as list items. Okay, let's talk about the value property. The value property will fetch or set the value of an input element. So what does this mean? In our example, we have referenced the input field which has an ID of todo input by var user input. The value property of the input field, or simply var user input, is then accessed using the dot notation followed by the word value, and we store this in var input value. I've included the HTML down below in case you'd like to go over it. We could have done all of this on one line as var user input is equal to document.getElementById todo input followed by dot value. And moving on, let's talk about the set attribute method. The set attribute method will set the attribute of the selected element. As I've mentioned before, attributes come in name-value pairs. And here you see we've used a set attribute to give the element a class attribute with the value of main container. Similarly, we can also give an element an onClick attribute whose value is a function, as you see here in our example where function foo is the assigned value of the onClick attribute of an element. Moving on, we can also create element nodes with the createElement DOM method. I've mentioned before that nodes are simply tags on the web page. In our example here, we've created a list and button element on our web page with the createElement method. The createTextNode method will create a text node which could be a string anywhere on the web page, and for us it's the string rover. And we've assigned the text rover to var text. And this is useful because we might want to use the same text in different sections of a web page, for example, a greeting alert or within a user panel, etc. So instead of creating a text node each time, we can simply use the variable which references the text node. And this takes us to the last DOM method that we will be discussing, that is the appendChild method. The word append means to add something to the end of a document. We add an element that we create to a web page using the appendChild method. And in order to append something to a web page, you must first create the element. That is, if it's already not hard-coded in your HTML. Secondly, you must choose where to append it. That is, choose a parent node. And thirdly, you append the element or child as it's called with the appendChild method. AppendChild will append an element to a chosen parent element. For example, we can choose to append a list tag to a parent unordered list tag which already exists on our page. Have a look at our example here. We have created an h1 node with the document.createElement method, and this is stored in var heading. This creates an opening and closing h1 tag on our page. We have then created a text node with the createTextNode method which creates the text rover. We then append the text node to the h1 tag with the appendChild method. So now the text sits in between the h1 tags. Now we append the h1 tag to the page with the document.body.appendChild heading, and this is because we want the element to be displayed in the body of our web page, and this is how it would look in HTML. The adding of new elements on a page depending on user input is what makes a web page dynamic. And you will use this method in the addItem function wherein a user's input will be added to the web page instantly. With that, let's move on to code our addItem function. Now have a look at the add button which has an onClick attribute whose value is the function addItem. This is the button on our page which says add. So when we type in something in the input box and click on the add button, we want it to appear as a list item within the UL tags in the list items div right here. And the list items div is here on the screen below the input field. And now back to main.js. Let's declare a function by typing function addItem and then structure it. In between the curly braces is where we put our logic. Now what we want to do is to get the value of whatever text is within the input field and store it within a variable. For that, let's declare a variable called var task and then assign it to refer to the input element with equal to document dot get element by ID to do input, and we access the value property of the input element with dot value and then finish off with a semicolon. Now let's also get the UL element on our page because we will be appending list items to our unordered list tag. And let's use the document.getElement by ID method again. So declare var UL and assign it to refer to the UL element by equal to document dot to these DOM elements in variables. We will be able to use them repeatedly, as you will see further on. So let's type what we have up to now, and let's alert task and head over to index.html in the browser. Now, if I type in 10 in the input field and click on the add button, I should see 10 in the alert box. And there you go. So let's head back to main.js. Now what we want to do is to keep adding items to our list as long as the number of items is less than 5. You could limit it to any number, for example 10. I'm just using 5, and the reason why I'm doing that is so that we don't have 100 items overflowing in the main div. And let's use an if statement. So structure an if conditional statement. And within the brackets, let's put our condition, which is task list dot length is less than 5. So remember, the task list array will hold all 5 of our items. As long as the number of list items is less than 5, we want to keep adding items from the input field when a user clicks on the add button to the task list array. And for this, we use an array method called push, which adds items to the end of an array. So type in task list dot push, and the thing that we want to push is the user input value stored in the task variable. Okay, so now let's alert the task list array and type in something in the input box to see how the push method works. And as you can see, I'm typing in 5 list items, and each one of them is separated by a comma. And I can no longer add in a 6th item. Moving on, we have our items in the task list array, but we want them to appear as list items on our web page. And for that, we will be using DOM methods. And let's go back to main.js. Now let's create a list element in the DOM with var li is equal to document dot create element, and within brackets and within quotation marks li. This is a DOM method that will create a list tag or node. Now let's create a text node using the DOM create text node method, which takes var task as an argument and will create a text node of it. So var text is equal to document dot create text node, open brackets, task, and close brackets. Okay, now let's add something to our list and click on the add button. And you don't see any list items being added. Well, this is because we need to append these items to something on our web page. So head back to main.js. Now we have our list node and our text node. So let's append the text node to its parent list node with li dot append child, and the child, which is text. The DOM append child method will append the text node to the list node. This would be the same as an open li tag and then some text and then close li tag. So for each item in the task list array, we have created a list node and appended the text within the input field, which is stored in the task variable to the list node. That was a mouthful, so take a break to go over what we just did if need be. If not, moving on, we also want to append the list node to the unordered list node in our HTML document, because remember, we've created the list node, but we need to insert it within the DOM. And let's use the append child method once again for that. So use var ul, which references the ul element on our page for us. ul dot append child, and within brackets the child, which is li. Now let's wrap our heads around what we just did. We appended our text node to our list node, and then we appended our list node to our ul node. Think about the structure as it would be in our HTML file, which would be open and close ul tag, and within the ul tag a list tag and some text in between the opening and closing list tag. So let's try this out. And type in some text in the input field and then click on Add. And there you go, we've added 5 list items. Let's also add a check mark and cross mark button besides each list item. The check mark button will allow you to strike through a list item as completed, whereas the cross mark button will allow you to remove the list item from your task list array as well as the DOM. Okay, so both look similar, and once we've written the code for one, the other one should be familiar. And head back to main.js. Now, let's create our check mark button first with var check mark is equal to document dot create element, and the element that we want to create, button. The create element DOM method will create a button element for us. And let's add some text inside the button to denote that it is a checkmark button. And for that, type in checkmark dot inner HTML is equal to, and within quotation marks, and check. The inner HTML property sets HTML content, which for us is a Unicode checkmark character inside a button. Let's add a class to this button with checkmark dot class name is equal to list item button. And if you look at your CSS file, you will see that we styled list buttons by selecting the list item button class. Okay, now when we click on the checkmark button, we want it to do something. We would like it to mark a list item as being completed. For that, we need to set the button to have an on-click attribute whose value will be the function that marks the list item as completed when the button is clicked. And this is exactly the same as our add button, which has an on-click function called add item, which coincidentally is what we're working on right now. So checkmark dot set attribute, and within brackets, open quotation mark, on click, and close quotation mark followed by a comma. And once again, within quotation marks, check me, and besides me, check me, within brackets, type in this, and finish off with a semicolon. Let's pause a bit so that you can type this down. In JavaScript, there is a lot of magic associated with the keyword this. In this particular instance, the this keyword refers to the particular button at the current index within the if conditional, as we will have 5 of these check mark buttons besides each list item. So the this keyword in the check me function simply refers to the one button out of the total 5 buttons that is clicked. Lastly, let's append the check mark button to the list node that we created above with li dot append child, and the child which is check mark. And great, we already appended our list node to the UL node. So let's see how this looks so far. And there you go. We've got a check mark button besides our list item, even though it doesn't do anything as yet. Now let's do exactly the same for the cross mark button. The only thing that will be different in this case is the inner HTML and the value of the on-click function of the button. So head back to main.js. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this portion right above where we append the list node to the UL node. You can either copy the code for the checkmark button and change it as needed, or type this out. And here you see we have created a variable called crossmark, which refers to a button that we created using the DOM createElement method. We then added a Unicode character to the inner HTML of our crossmark variable and then set its class to the same class as the checkmark button, since classes can be shared by elements. And moving on, we have an on-click function called removeMe, which takes the button at the current index within the if conditional statement as a parameter using the keyword this. We will go over the this keyword in more detail when we code the checkmark and crossmark functions. For now, keep in mind that the current button that is being clicked is passed as an argument to the checkmark and crossmark button functions with the this keyword. And lastly, we append our crossmark button to our newly created list node. And great, let's see how this looks. And as you can see, when I type in some text, we have the checkmark and crossmark button besides our list item. Now, just 2 small things to finish up this function. If you notice, we can add an empty string to our list. Now, let's take care of this by ensuring that you can't add an empty string to the list, so head back to main.js. And come up in the function right below where we declared our task and UL variables, and structure an if conditional statement like so. And now type in the condition, which is task dot trim, open and close brackets, dot length strictly equal to 0. Trim is a JavaScript method that removes white space from both sides of a string before and after a string. After trimming the string of all white space, we check the length of remaining characters using the length property of a string. If the string length is strictly equal to 0, that is, there are no words, letters, characters after removing all white space, then return false. This ensures that if the input field is empty and the user clicks on add, then nothing is added to the list. And this works for even if the user presses the spacebar twice and then clicks on add. And this condition is placed at the top since we want to check for an empty string before adding items to the task list array. And this is why order of declaring and checking things is important. Okay, great. Now let's fix our conditional statement before we move on. We have two if statements here. So after the first if statement closes and before the second if statement starts, add in else and open curly braces. And then come down and add in the closing curly brace right here before the closing brace for the function. And this means if the user input is not empty, then run the if condition in the else block. Let's do one last thing before we move on. Within the second if statement, call the reset function. The reset function will reset the input box or input field, and it is within the if conditional statement as it is called after each time that an item is added to the DOM and task list array. Great, we've finished our add item function, so let's save this and let's head over and see what it looks like by typing something in and then clicking on add. And great, now let's continue on to the next function, which is reset. Now let's code the reset function. This function, like I mentioned in the previous section, is called from within the add item function. It will reset the value of the input field to a blank after an item is added to the list. So declare function reset and let's get the input field element from our page with document dot get element by ID and the ID of the input field element, which is todo input. And then let's access its value property by dot value. And then set it to an empty string. An empty string is denoted by open and close quotation marks with no space in between, and it has a length of 0 characters. So let's try this out. And great, you see that the input field is reset each time that a list item is added. In the next function, we'll be working on getting the check mark button to strike and unstrike through an item. We will be working on the check mark button on click function, so let's go over these 3 topics here that we'll be using in our function. The parent element property returns the parent of a specific element. In our project, we have 5 list items on our web page as list nodes or tags. In order to get the parent of the list nodes, we access the parent element property of our list items with the dot notation. In this example here, you can see that we get an element with the ID of myLI using the document.getElementById method and assign it to var li. And let's assume that this is a list element. We then access the parent element property of var li with the dot notation and assign it to var ul, which let's assume is the ul parent of the list node on the web page. So what happens if an element has no parent? All elements on a page will have a parent whether or not they're contained within a div. If there is no parent like a div or UL element, then the body tag of the HTML document is the parent. In the second example here, document.parent element will return null as document is the first node and has no parent. The parent property is useful because it'll allow us to navigate through the DOM. Okay, now let's move on to the conditional operator. And this can be used in place of the if-else conditional statement. And here you see the structure of the conditional operator. Within the brackets is a condition, and we check if the condition evaluates to true. If so, then it returns the value of the first expression, and that is assigned to the result. And if the condition is false, then it returns the value of the second expression, which is assigned to the result instead. In our example here, we are checking if the first number is lesser than or greater than the second number. In the example, var result is assigned the result of the evaluation of the condition 3 is less than 5. And since this is true, then the value of the first expression, which is the string is true, is assigned to var result. And we confirm this by console logging it. And let's reverse this. So what if the condition checks if 3 is greater than 5? Well, since this is false, var result is assigned the value of the second expression, which states the expression is false since 3 is not greater than 5. Now, we won't be getting into the nitty-gritty of the this keyword. The this keyword in JavaScript takes on different values depending on its scope. That is, local scope if it's within a function, or global scope if it's outside a function. The use of the this keyword for us in our project will be in a specific way, as this is a whole subject by itself. So keeping that in mind, we'll talk about the this keyword and what it means in the context of an on-click function. And let's understand this through an example because this is how we'll be using it. In function foo, item is the argument passed. We are alerting the ID property of the item DOM element with item.property. And now have a look at our HTML here. So what does item refer to then? Remember, in our calculator project, we had passed different numbers as arguments to the onClick function setValue. And setValue in the function declaration took number as an argument. Well, in this case, look at the 4 buttons with the IDs of button 1, button 2, button 3, and button 4. And each one of these has an onClick attribute whose value is the function foo that takes the keyword this as an argument. And this refers to the particular button being clicked out of all these buttons here. So when we click on button 1, then the ID button 1 is alerted. Similarly, if we click on button 4, then the ID button 4 is alerted. And this is because the this keyword belongs to the onClick function, which is the attribute of the specific HTML button being clicked. And we will leave it at that. Now let's go ahead and code the checkMe function, and hopefully this should become clearer. In this function, we will code the functionality for when the checkmark button besides each list item is clicked. Now, if you go up here to the add item function, you can see that the checkMe function is the onClick attribute for the checkmark button. And once again, let's declare a function with function and the same name as we put above, which is check me. And within the brackets, type in item. Item is the function's argument. And if you see above in our onClick function for the checkmark button, we have passed the this keyword to the checkMe function. So item refers to this particular button. And let's alert item to see what we mean. And the alert box shows us that item refers to this particular HTML button element. And if we add another item and then click on the check mark button, then item refers to this specific HTML button element. Now, what we want to do is that whenever the check mark button is clicked, the list item besides it should be crossed off as being completed, and if the button is clicked again, then the line through across the item should be removed. And for this, we will be using the HTML DOM parent element property. So head back to main.js. Now the parent element property will return the parent of the chosen element. And to select the parent for the particular button, type in var li tag is equal to item dot parent element. And great, now we have the parent of our button, which is the list node that we created above in our add item function. And if you remember, in the add item function, when we create list nodes on our web page, and within each li opening and closing tag is the corresponding input text from the user and the check mark and cross mark buttons. And so the parent of each button is the corresponding list node. So to check on this, type in alert and then let's head to a page and add an item. Click on add and then click on the checkmark button. And there you go, it says object HTML li element. And now for the last part of this function, head back to main.js. What we'll be doing is crossing the item when the checkmark button is pressed. And then if an item is crossed and we click on the checkmark button again, we want it to undo the line across the item. This enriches the user experience as they're allowed to strike through and undo a strike through across an item as they please. So let's use var li tag, which refers to the list node, and then apply a CSS style to it by accessing its style property and then setting it to dot text decoration. The style object allows you to set the value of a specific CSS property like we just did. And this should be familiar to you from the text decoration style rule in CSS. The conditional operator in JavaScript assigns a value to a variable based on some condition, and the variable for us is var li tag. Therefore, the text decoration style of the li tag is the result of the fulfillment of some condition. So, if the statement that the li tag has a text decoration strictly equal to line through is true, then when the check mark button is clicked, the list item should now have a text decoration of none. else if the statement that the list item has a text decoration of line through is false. That is, there is no text decoration. Then when the Check Me button is clicked, change the text decoration to a line through. Technically, our list element has no style rule for text decoration in the CSS file, so by default, this style rule is an empty string. And you could have also done something like this. And this will do the same thing as the condition checks whether the list tag style text decoration doesn't exist. Therefore, if the condition is true and it's an empty string, then when the button is clicked, set it to a line through. And similarly, if an item already has a line through and the text decoration strictly equal to an empty string is false, then set it to have no text decoration. And now let's try this out. And as you can see, we can strike through an item as completed when we click on the check mark besides a list item. And upon clicking the button again, it removes the strike through text decoration. And if you'd like to take a break, you may review parent-child relationships in the DOM and the conditional operator. Else, let's move on to the remove me function. And now we'll be talking about these two topics related to the remove me function. Starting off with the DOM remove child method. This method, as its name suggests, will remove the child of a parent element. And its usage is, as you can see on here. We use the remove child method on the parent, which takes its child to remove as an argument. And we will be using this to remove a list node, which is the child of its parent unordered list node. Okay, moving on, let's talk about the array pop method. The pop method removes or pops the last element of an array, and here you see its usage. In our example, the array names holds 3 items of the string data type, apples, oranges, and pears. Names.pop pops off the last item, which is pears. And when we console log names, we see that there are 2 remaining items in the array, apples and oranges. Therefore, the pop method has modified the length property of the array and made it shorter, compared to the push method, which modifies the length of an array by increasing it. Let's now work on the remove me function. This function will remove individual list items when the button with onClick is equal to remove me is clicked. We will be doing 2 things. First off, removing the list item from the DOM, and secondly, removing the list item from the task list array. Because remember that an item from within the array is displayed on the page with the add item function. So we need to remove the list item from both the DOM and the array. And let's declare our remove me function. And the function takes an argument called item. And to reiterate, item refers to the this keyword in remove me, and the this keyword refers to the specific HTML button element besides each list item. And to confirm this, let's alert item. And there you go. Item within the function's argument refers to the specific button besides a list item that is clicked. And now if I type in some text and then click on add, and then click on this cross mark button. Now this alert message which says HTML button element refers to the particular button that I just clicked. As a reminder, remember that when we created and added elements to the DOM, a button element is nested within a list element or list node in the DOM. So head back to main.js. And now declare a local variable with var li tag and assign its value to be the parent of the specific cross me button clicked using the parent element property. And this gets us the list parent of the specific button clicked. And now let's get the parent of the list node. So declare var ul tag and assign var ul tag to be the parent of var li tag with the parent element property. And now remove the list item by calling the remove child method on var ul tag and pass li tag as the child to remove. And this will remove the particular list node which is the child of the ul node. And let's alert task list and try the cross mark button. Okay, so we've removed the list item from the page as you can see, but alert task list indicates that our item is still in the task list array. So let's remove it from there as well and head back to main.js. And with the dot notation, use the pop method on the task list array. Pop removes the last element in an array. And now let's alert task list again after task list pop to confirm removal from the array. And there you go. We've removed the item from both our array with the pop method and from the DOM with the remove child method. The array pop method removes the last item from an array, which for us is the list item associated with the specific cross mark button that is clicked. And now let's move on to the next part of our project, which is to be able to add an item to our list by pressing down on the Enter key on the keyboard. Events are occurrences that occur either because of some user-initiated action, such as clicking on a button, or a change initiated by the document itself, such as a web page loading. The DOM event we've been using so far is a user clicking on buttons to do something. And when an event occurs, event handlers, as the name suggests, will handle the event. And event handlers execute functions in response to an event. They usually start with the on word followed by the name of the event that occurred. For example, on click. We can register an event handler to an HTML element as we have been doing by registering the event handler as the HTML attribute on click to a button. For example, button on click is equal to handle click. So when a user clicks on the button, therefore resulting in a DOM click event, the function associated with the onClick event handler will take care of it. There are other DOM event handlers, for example, on change, on key up, etc. And now that we have a little background information on event handlers, let's concentrate on the onKeyUp event handler. So there are different types of keyboard events and event handlers, such as onKeyUp, onKeyDown, keyPress, etc., which handle these keyboard events. The event that we are going to use is when a user presses on and releases the enter key. For example, how we do when we're typing. When this event occurs, we will use the onKeyUp event handler to trigger a function in response. Now, moving on, every key on the keyboard has a number associated with it. The key code property of the key pressed will return the number associated with that particular key, and the key code of the enter key is the number 13. This may seem like unrelated bits of information, but let's head over to main.js and work on the enter key function so that you can see how it all fits together. In this function, we will enable a user to add an item to the list by using the enter key on the keyboard. Okay, let's declare an enter key function and structure it. And we want user input to be affected by the onKeyUp event. So let's declare var input is equal to document dot get element by ID, and within brackets and quotation marks to do input. Let's not forget the semicolon to denote the end of a statement. And now within the function, let's bind our onKeyUp event handler to the input element with input dot onKeyUp, which means that now the onKeyUp event handler is associated with the input element on the page and not some other element. For example, clicking on the check mark or cross mark buttons won't do anything. So now when the onKeyUp event occurs, let's trigger a function. So is equal to function and open and close brackets, and within brackets type in key and then open and close curly braces. Our function takes an argument called key. The argument symbolizes what key has been pressed. Now let's write our function logic. Okay, let's think about how we want to go about this. So what we want is for the function to detect what key has been pressed, and if, the keyword here being if, the enter key is pressed down and released, then we want the item to be added to the list. So we don't want the function to execute if, say, the K letter on the keyboard has been pressed and released. The function should only execute if the enter key has been pressed and released. So let's structure an if conditional for this. And now put in our condition key dot key code strictly equal to the number 13. Remember, I said that every key on the keyboard is associated with a number called key code. So in our condition, we are determining whether the key pressed has a key code property equivalent to the number 13, which is the key code for the enter key. And if so, we want to add the item. And we already wrote our add item function, which does just that. So call the add item function from within the enter key function if the key pressed is the enter key. Now remember that this function has not been called anywhere. For a function to execute, it must be called. Our addItem function is called when the add button is clicked from within the HTML document. Then our check mark and cross mark functions are called from within the addItem function in main.js when the check mark and cross mark buttons are clicked. So keep in mind that the enter key function isn't attached to any HTML element on our page. So we need to call it from within main.js like so. And let's go try this out. And using the enter key now, press on enter, and great, everything looks just fine. Now let's work on the last part of our project, which is to clear the DOM and the task list array when the clear button is clicked. And now we'll discuss these 3 ways of emptying an array, starting off with splice. The splice method takes 2 arguments within brackets. Firstly, the starting position you want to splice the array from, that is the index start, and secondly, the number of items you want to remove. The splice method will splice from the index start till the number of items to remove and return the removed array. Okay, let's have a look at our examples here. We have an array called task list with 5 items of string data type, each separated by a comma. Now, when we use the splice method on task list, taking 0 as its start index and 2 as the number of items to remove, starting from index 0, then what is removed is project 2 at index 0 and dinner plans, since the number of items to remove is 2. Remember, index of an item is not the same as the number of items or the length of an array. And console log the splice method shows us what we removed. So now when we console log task list array after the splice, you see that we're left with the remaining 3 items, which are call mom, take Roger out for a walk, and finish math set. Similarly, if we splice from index 1 and remove 1 item from the task list array, then it will remove that one particular item as the starting index and number of items to remove is the same, that is exactly 1. And console log task list array lists all the items in the array except for the one item we removed, that is dinner plans at index 1. And in our last example, we call the splice method on the task list array starting from position 0 and taking the entire content of the array as the number of items to remove as represented by tasklist.length. Because if you remember, tasklist.length will give the number of items in an array. We could have just used the number 5 as the number of items to remove, since only 5 items are present in our list. But tasklist.length will make our code more flexible, as we could choose to add up to 100 items in our task list array, and tasklist.length would work just as well. Okay, moving on, let's now discuss the second method of emptying an array. The length property of an array returns the number of items in an array. In order to empty an array, we could simply access its length property with the dot notation and then assign the array a length of 0, which means the number of items in the array will now be 0 or no items at all. Moving on, let's now talk about the pop method. If you remember from our removeMe function, the pop method removes or pops the last item in an array. In order to remove all the items of an array using the pop method, we use while. A while loop will keep running while a condition is true. Once the condition is false, the while loop will terminate. In this example, the condition is while task list.length is greater than 0. In other words, while the number of items in the task list array is greater than 0 and it has items, we will keep calling the pop method, which will keep removing the last item of the array till there is nothing left to remove or pop. And with this, let's go ahead and work on the clear list function. And now we will code our clear list function, which will clear all list items from the DOM and the task list array. So go ahead and declare your function. And now declare local var ul, which is the reference to the ul node in the HTML document, with the document.getElementById method. And then let's clear the HTML content of var ul by setting its inner HTML property to an empty string with ul.innerHTML is equal to an empty string. This clears the DOM of the HTML content of the UL node, which includes all the list nodes and buttons. However, this doesn't remove list items from the task list array, and we can check on that by alerting task list dot length. And there you go. After adding items to the list and clicking on the clear button, the items are still within the task list array. So head back to main.js. To remove all items in the task list array, let's use the splice method. And once again, it takes two arguments: the starting index in the array that you want to splice from, and the number of items to remove from the array. So type in task list dot splice, and within brackets 0, comma, task list dot length. An array's starting index is at position 0. We are removing all list items, that is the length of the entire task list array. Therefore, we use the task list dot length as the second argument in the splice method. You can use the number 5 as the second argument in the splice method, as there are 5 items in our list. However, taskList.length is more flexible in case you decide to change the maximum number of items allowed in the list. And let's alert taskList.length after the splice method. Items such as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then clicking on the clear button, we get a 0 as the number of elements in the array, which sounds right. And with this, we finish our clear list function. And this completes our to-do list project. To reiterate, we used an array, array methods, functions, if and else conditional statements, and the onKeyUp event to code our project. Feel free to change things around and play with the code, figuring out other ways you can achieve the same task. And with this, let's move on to our next project in the series.